Della Voss pulled the hammer back on her rifle with both children pressed flat against the snow behind her. The man on the horse wasn't moving. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was barely breathing. Ruth grabbed the back of her coat. Henry didn't make a sound, which scared Della more than anything she had taught him. That silence meant danger. The man slid sideways in the saddle, and Della had 1 second to decide whether to let a stranger die in her camp or step forward and catch him. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow Della's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that cold Montana night and find out what one woman with 2 children, an empty purse, and a Dutch oven full of courage did when the wilderness sent a dying man to her fire. The fire had been burning for 3 hours before the horse appeared at the tree line. Della heard it first, the labored rhythm of hooves breaking through crusted snow, too slow and too uneven for an animal under normal command. Her hand was already on the rifle before she turned around. Ruth looked up from the bedroll where she'd been keeping Henry warm, and Della caught her daughter's eyes and gave one small shake of her head. "Stay." Ruth pulled Henry closer without a word. The horse came through the pines like something dragged out of a nightmare. Gray thin, her breath coming in desperate clouds. The rider on her back was slumped forward at an angle that meant he was either dead or close enough that the difference wasn't worth arguing about. His hands weren't on the reins. He was just hanging there, held in the saddle by nothing except the sheer stubbornness of a body that hadn't gotten the message yet. Della pulled the hammer back. She stood with the rifle raised and the fire at her back, and her children 6 feet behind her, and she did not shake. She had learned a long time ago that shaking was a luxury for people who could afford to be afraid. The horse stopped at the edge of the firelight and just stood there, her head hanging nearly to the ground. The rider didn't move, didn't raise his hands, didn't say a word. "You alive?" Della called out. "Nothing. I asked you a question. You alive or not?" The man's head moved just slightly, like the word alive had traveled all the way down from some distant place and arrived too weak to do much when it got there. A sound came out of him that was more air than voice. "Trying to be," he said. Ruth's grip on Henry tightened. Della could feel it without looking. She kept the rifle up and walked forward 3 steps, enough to see his face in the firelight. He was young enough to be dangerous and old enough to know better, with the kind of hollowness in his cheeks that came from days without food rather than years without comfort. His lips were cracked raw. His hands, resting useless against the saddle horn, were the color of old ash. "You got weapons?" she asked. "Colt, hip, rifle, saddle." A pause. "Knife, boot. You planning to use any of them?" He made a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd had the energy to finish it. "Ma'am, I can't feel my hands. I couldn't use a weapon right now if I wanted to, which I don't." Della studied him for a long moment. The horse shifted beneath him, and the motion nearly sent him off the saddle entirely. He grabbed for the horn and missed, and it was that the way his hand reached and found nothing that made her decision for her. She lowered the rifle. "Get down," she said. "Slow. Don't fall into my fire." "Doing my best." He got down the way a man gets down when his legs have forgotten they're supposed to work all at once, and with no grace whatsoever. He caught the saddle, caught the stirrup, and ended up on one knee in the snow with his head bowed and both hands flat on the ground like he was praying to it. "Ruth," Della said without turning around, "bring the blanket from my pack, the heavy one." "Mama." "The blanket, please." She heard her daughter move. The rifle went back over her shoulder, and Della crossed to the man and grabbed his arm and got him up by main force, which was not a small thing, and was also not a thing she intended to apologize for. He was heavier than he looked. Most men were. "Can you walk?" If walk means fall sideways toward the fire, then yes. "Lean on me. Don't be proud about it." "Yes, ma'am." She got him to the log she used as a seat, and he sat down and just breathed for a moment, his elbows on his knees and his head hanging. Ruth appeared at Della's elbow with the heavy wool blanket and Della took it and dropped it over the man's shoulders without ceremony. Henry had come out from behind the bedroll. He was standing 6 feet back with his arms crossed over his chest, the way he crossed them when he was trying to look braver than he felt, which was something that made Della's heart break a little every time she saw it. He was 6 years old. He shouldn't have needed to practice looking brave. "Those your children?" the man asked, his voice still ragged but gaining ground. "They are. I'm sorry for scaring them." "They weren't scared," Ruth said in the flat, certain tone of a 9-year-old who was absolutely scared and refused to admit it. The man looked at her. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile, because he didn't have the reserves for a full smile. "You're right," he said. "I apologize for startling you then." Ruth considered this with the gravity of a magistrate. "Accepted," she said finally. Henry took 2 steps closer. "Your horse is sad," he said. "Henry," Della said. "She is sad, Mama. Look at her." The gray mare was standing at the edge of the firelight, exactly where she'd stopped. Her head still low, her eyes half closed. She looked like an animal that had decided to stop expecting anything good. "He's right," the man said quietly. "Ash has had a hard week. We both have." He looked at Della. "I don't want to impose on your supplies, ma'am. I can see you're traveling. If you could just let us rest by your fire until morning." "How long since you've eaten?" He was quiet for a moment. "Tuesday." Della looked at the pot hanging over the coals. She looked at her children. She looked at the pot again and did the calculation that mothers do, the quiet arithmetic of enough and not enough, and what sacrifice buys and what it costs. "Tuesday was 3 days ago," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You can smell what's in that pot." "Yes, ma'am. I've been smelling it since the ridge." He kept his eyes on the fire. "I'm not asking for any. I'm just asking for the fire. If I'd wanted you to just have the fire, I'd have left you on the ground." She went to the pot without another word and ladled out a portion into her spare tin plate. Not the largest portion, not the smallest. The portion that a person gave when they had enough to share and not enough to waste, and when they'd decided that the difference between those two things mattered less than the fact that a human being in front of them was starving. She brought the plate to him and held it out. He looked at it for a moment before he took it, and when he looked up at her, there was something in his face that she didn't particularly want to name. "Thank you," he said. "Eat slow. Your stomach's been empty long enough that it'll fight you if you rush." He ate slow, or he tried to. She could see what it cost him to slow down the visible effort of a man overriding every instinct his body had screaming at him to just consume. He managed it. She gave him credit for that. Ruth came and sat beside Della without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders touched. Henry came and sat on Della's other side and leaned against her arm. They were good at that, her children, coming to anchor without being asked. "You got a name?" Della asked. "Cole Hargrove." He looked up between bites. "You, Della Voss." "Where are you headed, Mrs. Voss?" "Miss, and that's my business." He nodded, accepting this the way a man accepted things when he was sitting by someone else's fire, eating someone else's food. Fair enough. "And these two—" "This is Ruth," Della said. "And this is Henry." "Ruth." Cole looked at her daughter with that incomplete, almost smile. "That's a name that means something." Ruth lifted her chin. "It means a loyal woman who follows where she needs to go, even when it's hard." "Do you know that, or did someone tell you?" "Mama told me. But I looked it up myself after to make sure she wasn't just saying it to make me feel good." Cole's face did something complicated. "Your mama's not the kind of woman who says things just to make people feel good, I take it." "No, sir," Ruth said with the absolute confidence of 9 years of direct evidence. "That's a fine quality." He looked at Della. "In a person and in a mother." Della said nothing. She put more wood on the fire. Henry had been watching Cole eat with the intense, focused attention of a child who had learned to observe adults carefully and draw conclusions. "You're a lawman," he said. Cole looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "The way you checked your gun when you sat down. You didn't check it because you were scared of us. You checked it to make sure it was safe. Lawmen do that." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's a sharp thing to notice." "Henry notices everything," Ruth said, not with pride exactly, more with the weary acknowledgement of a sibling who had learned that her little brother's observations were accurate and inconvenient in equal measure. "Deputy," Cole said, "out of Billings, or was until about a week ago." He looked at the plate, then back at the fire. "I've been tracking a man named Garrett Soul. Killed a family on the North Road, took their horses and their winter stores. Took me 6 days out here, and I lost the trail this afternoon." Della looked at him steadily. "A family?" "Yes, ma'am." "How many?" Cole was quiet for a beat too long. "3, he said. "Man, woman, and a boy about Henry's age." The fire popped. Nobody spoke for a moment. Henry looked at his mother. Then he looked at Cole. "Did you find him?" he asked. "Not yet." "Are you going to?" "I aim to." Henry thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "Good," he said finally. Della stood up and went to check on the mare. The horse let her approach without any resistance, which said more about her exhaustion than her temperament. Della ran her hands along the animal's neck and felt the ribs too close to the surface and the muscles too tight with fatigue. "She's been carrying you too hard," she said loud enough for Cole to hear. "I know. I'm sorry for it. There's a creek 20 yards north. I'll take her when you're done eating. We've got a little grain left." "Miss Voss, you don't have to. The horse didn't choose to be out here any more than my children did. She deserves water and grain." He didn't argue after that. When she came back from the creek with the mare settled and fed, Cole was sitting exactly where she'd left him, but he'd eaten the plate clean and the color had started to come back into his face, which meant the food was doing what food did when a body desperately needed it. Henry was asleep against Della's bedroll. Ruth was sitting close to the fire with her knees pulled up and her eyes tracking Cole with the patient watchfulness she'd inherited from her mother, and probably would have preferred not to. "How long have you been traveling alone?" Cole asked when Della settled back down. "What makes you think I'm alone?" "There's no second adult in this camp. The supply arrangement is everything a woman thinks of and nothing a man remembers to bring. And your children look to you for every decision not around the camp for someone else." Della looked at him. 2 months, she said. "From Billings." "From Billings." He waited. She didn't volunteer more, and he didn't push. "You can sleep by the fire," she said instead. "I've got first watch. You look like you need about 12 hours before you're fit for anything. I can take a watch. Can you keep your eyes open?" He considered this honestly. "Probably not for long. Then you'll take second watch when I wake you. My children sleep better when someone's keeping watch, and right now that someone is me." "How long have they been sleeping light?" The question landed differently than she expected. Most people didn't ask how long. They asked what happened, or they made assumptions and moved on. The how long was a different kind of question. "Since their father died," she said. 14 months ago. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He was sick a long time before he went. We'd been grieving him for 2 years before the actual end. By the time it came, it was almost—" She stopped. "That's more than you need to know. You don't have to apologize for saying true things." "I'm not apologizing. I'm being practical." She looked across the fire at him. "You asked where we were headed. I didn't answer. I'll answer now. You don't owe me—" "I know I don't owe you anything. I'm choosing to tell you because you're going to be in this camp overnight, and I'd rather you know our situation plainly than have you filling in the blanks with guesses." She straightened her back. "We're heading to Cutter's Creek. There's a new hotel going up there, the Sentinel. I heard they need kitchen staff. I'm a cook." Cole looked at her. Not at her body the way most men looked, calculating and comparing, measuring her against some standard she'd never had a say in setting. He looked at her the way you looked at a person when you were actually trying to understand them. "What kind of cook?" he asked. Something about the question, just that what kind, as if there were a range of answers worth knowing, made Della breathe in a way she hadn't for a while. "The kind that makes you forget where you are," she said. He nodded slowly. That's what this was. He gestured at the empty plate. "I've been in this wilderness for 6 days, eating jerky and cold creek water. This tasted like somewhere safe. I don't know how else to say it." "You don't have to say it any other way." Ruth had been listening to all of this without appearing to listen, which was a skill she had perfected to an art form. "Mama had a job in Billings," she said in the tone of someone who had decided that all relevant information should be on the table. "At the Grand Continental Hotel. She was there for 4 years. They let her go in October." "Ruth," Della said quietly. "He's going to wonder. People always wonder, and they make up worse stories than the true one." Cole looked at Ruth with what appeared to be genuine respect. "She's not wrong," he said. Della was quiet for a moment. "They let me go because the owner's wife decided I wasn't the right presentation for a fine establishment." Those were her exact words. Right presentation. She kept her voice level. She meant that a woman who looks like me standing in the doorway of a dining room made the guests uncomfortable, reminded them of something they didn't want to think about while they were eating their expensive meals. Cole said nothing. He was good at that, at not filling silences with the wrong things. "I had a choice," Della continued. "Make myself smaller. Stay quiet. Find some back kitchen work somewhere that would keep my name off the menu and my face out of the dining room. Or leave." She looked at the fire. "I have 2 children watching everything I do. Every single day, they are watching what I do when the world tells me I don't belong." "What did you tell them?" Cole asked. "When you left?" "I told them we were going somewhere better." She looked at Henry sleeping at the soft way his chest moved up and down. "I intend to make that true." "Cutter's Creek," Cole said. "Cutter's Creek." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know Cutter's Creek. Passed through 2 years ago. Small, but growing fast. The Sentinel Hotel, that's Harlan Webb's project. He's ambitious. Wants to build the best establishment between here and Helena." "You think he'd hire a woman like me?" Cole looked at her directly. "I think any man with sense and a working palate who tastes your food would hire you so fast he'd trip over himself getting the paperwork drawn up." Ruth made a small sound of satisfaction. Henry slept on. "You don't know what else I can cook," Della said. "No. But I know what that stew was, and that was a woman who understands that food is either something you endure or something you experience, and that the difference between those two things comes down entirely to whether the person making it gives a damn." He looked at the empty plate. "You give a damn." Della stood up and took the plate from him without responding, because the response that wanted to come out was something too honest for a stranger by a fire on their first night, and she had learned to be careful about honest things that wanted to come out at the wrong time. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll wake you in 4 hours." "Miss Voss." She turned. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for the food. For treating my horse like she deserved to be treated. For answering my questions straight. For—" He stopped. "Just, thank you." Della looked at him for a moment. He was sitting wrapped in her blanket with the firelight on his face and 3 days of starvation behind him, and something in his eyes that was not pity and was not calculation, and was not the careful nothing that most men arrange their faces into when they looked at her. She couldn't name what it was yet. She wasn't sure she wanted to. "Don't make it into more than it is," she said. "You were in trouble. I helped. That's what people do." "Not always," he said quietly. She turned back to the fire without answering because he was right, and she knew he was right, and that knowledge sat in her chest, the way cold sat in old bones, deep and settled and unwilling to be argued with. The wind moved through the pines. The mare shifted at her picket line. Henry murmured something in his sleep, and Ruth reached over without looking and adjusted his blanket with a small automatic tenderness that had nothing learned about it. Della kept watch and let the silence work, and for the first time in 2 months, the silence didn't feel entirely like a wound. She had no way of knowing, sitting there with the fire between herself and a half-dead stranger and her children breathing steady at her back, that Cole Hargrove was going to be the kind of trouble that changed everything. Not the dangerous kind. The other kind. The kind that crept in while you were busy surviving and made itself at home before you thought to check the door. She had no way of knowing that the woman she was right now, exhausted, underfunded, traveling through a wilderness that didn't care whether she made it, was the last version of herself she would ever be alone. But the fire burned warm, and Henry slept, and Ruth finally let her eyes close. And Della Voss sat in the cold Montana dark, with a rifle across her knees and a Dutch oven cooling at her feet, and she did what she had always done. She kept going. Morning came the way bad news came, quiet and unavoidable. Della had let Cole sleep through his watch. She hadn't planned to. She'd sat there with the fire burning low and the cold pressing in from every direction, and when the time came to wake him, she looked at his face in the dying light and saw something that stopped her hand halfway to his shoulder. He looked like a man who hadn't slept without one eye open in years. She recognized that because she'd been wearing the same face herself for 14 months. She let him sleep. By the time he woke on his own, Ruth had already packed half the camp, and Henry was feeding the last of the grain to Ash with the solemn concentration of a child performing a sacred duty. Cole sat up and looked around, and then looked at Della with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and embarrassment. "You didn't wake me," he said. "No. I was supposed to take second watch. I know what you were supposed to do." He rubbed his face with both hands. "You were up all night. I've been up all night before. I'll be up all night again." She handed him a tin cup of coffee without looking at him. "Drink that. We're moving in 20 minutes. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her over the rim. Della kept her back to him, rolling the last bedroll with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this action more times in the last 2 months than she cared to count. "Cutter's Creek is west. You said you lost the trail of your man. His last known direction was also west, you said, toward the Highland Pass." "That's right. Then we're going the same direction." She tied the bedroll with 2 sharp knots. "I'm not inviting you to travel with us. I'm stating a fact about geography." Cole was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to smile and wisely deciding against it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Ruth looked up from the pack she was securing to Bear's saddle and gave Cole a look that said she had followed this exchange perfectly and had drawn her own conclusions, which she would share with no one until the appropriate moment. Henry just patted Ash on the nose and said, "She's feeling better today. I can tell." "How can you tell?" Cole asked, standing up and working the stiffness out of his back with a grimace that he didn't quite manage to hide. "Her ears," Henry said. "Yesterday they were sad ears. Today they're listening ears." Cole looked at his horse with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "He's right," he said. "She does look better." He looked at Della. "How much grain did you give her?" "Enough." "That was your grain." "It was my grain to give. Let's move." They broke camp in silence. That wasn't uncomfortable, just purposeful. Della had learned the difference in the last 2 months. Uncomfortable silence had weight to it, the kind that pressed on the chest. Purposeful silence was just people doing what needed doing without wasting breath on it. Cole worked without being told. He kicked snow over the fire ring, checked the picket line, helped Henry get up into the saddle when the boy's foot slipped on the stirrup. He did all of it with the economy of a man who understood that in the wilderness, usefulness was the only currency that meant anything. They were moving through the pines before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. For the first hour, nobody said much. Ruth rode close to Della's left side, her eyes moving over the landscape with the watchfulness she'd developed early and carried always. Henry rode behind Cole on Ash, which had been entirely Henry's idea and which Della had allowed only after a long moment of private calculation that involved assessing Cole Hargrove against every category of man she had learned to be careful around. He didn't fit the categories. She wasn't sure yet whether that was reassuring or a different kind of warning. "Mama," Ruth said, bringing her horse alongside Della's in a stretch of open terrain between two pine stands. "Are we going to let him come all the way to Cutter's Creek?" "I haven't decided." He helped Henry with the stirrup without making it into a big thing. "I noticed. Papa used to make things into big things," Ruth said in the careful, neutral tone she used when she was testing whether a truth was safe to say out loud. "He didn't mean to, but he always made Henry feel stupid when he couldn't do something. Your father loved you both. I know. He just didn't always know how to show it without—" She stopped. "Never mind. I'm just saying. Cole didn't make it a big thing." Della looked at her daughter, at the serious set of her small face, at the way she carried herself in the saddle, like a woman twice her age had been put inside a child's body by some clerical error. Ruth Voss had been born old. Della had sometimes wondered whether that was her fault. "One day at a time," Della said. "We don't make plans about people we've known for 12 hours. You made a plan when you took his watch." Della didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't try to give one. They stopped around midday in a hollow between two ridges where the wind dropped enough to make eating something other than an act of endurance. Della unpacked the food without ceremony: dried biscuits, a strip of smoked venison she'd been rationing, some dried apples she'd put up in October. Not much. Enough. Cole looked at what she laid out and then looked away, which told her he was doing the same arithmetic she was. "I've got jerky," he said. "In my left saddlebag. It's not—" He paused. "It's not your cooking, but it adds to the count." "Bring it." He brought it. Della incorporated it into the meal without comment, breaking the larger pieces into portions that put slightly more on Ruth and Henry's plates, because they were children, and growing children burned through food like kindling. Cole watched her do this. He didn't say anything about it. Henry ate with the focused speed of a small boy who had been cold all morning and wanted fuel more than flavor. Ruth ate methodically. Cole ate slowly, which told Della that the lesson from last night had taken, or that he was managing his body the way a man managed a horse that had been pushed too hard carefully and with deliberate patience. "Can I ask you something?" Ruth said, looking at Cole in the direct way she had, which unsettled most adults and appeared to have no particular effect on him. "You can ask," he said. "Why are you really following this man? You said he killed a family, but Mama said you lost your badge and you're not a deputy anymore. So who are you following him for?" "Ruth," Della said. "It's a real question." Cole looked at Ruth for a moment. Then he set down the last of his jerky. "For the boy," he said. "The boy that family had. He was about Henry's age, maybe a little younger, and when I got to that homestead and saw what was left—" He stopped. Restarted. "I filed the reports and I turned in my badge and then I saddled Ash and I went after him. Not for the county, just because." Henry had looked up from his plate. "Because someone should," he said. Cole looked at him. "Yeah, because someone should." Henry nodded, satisfied with this, and went back to his food. Ruth maintained her direct gaze on Cole for 3 more seconds, her standard duration for determining whether an adult was telling the truth, and then turned her attention back to her own plate with the air of someone who had reached a verdict. Della said nothing. She drank her water and watched the ridgeline to the north, and thought about the way Cole had said for the boy, the particular catch in his voice that was the sound of a person trying to keep something contained that kept wanting to expand. She knew that sound. She heard it in her own voice sometimes when she talked about Thomas, about the year he'd gotten sick, about the slow, terrible arithmetic of watching someone diminish. She didn't trust Cole Hargrove. It was too early to trust him. But she was beginning to understand him, which was a different thing, and sometimes the beginning of something. They made good time through the afternoon. Cole rode ahead when the terrain got rough, picking a path through snow that was deeper than it looked, and over ground that had that particular false solidity that meant ice underneath. He was good at it, she noticed. Better than she'd expected from a man who'd been half dead 12 hours earlier. Around 4 in the afternoon, with the light starting to go golden and cold, he pulled up short on a ridge and held up one hand. Della stopped immediately. Ruth stopped. Henry, who had moved back to bear with Della when the terrain got complicated, grabbed the saddle horn. "What is it?" Della asked quietly. Cole was looking at the valley below them. He didn't answer for a moment. Then, smoke. Down there. 2 miles, maybe. Della looked. He was right. A thin thread of gray against the pale sky. "Could be travelers," she said. "Could be. Could be your man. Could be." He turned in the saddle to look at her. "I need to ride ahead and check. Alone. I need you to take the children and hold here. There's a stand of rock on the east side of this ridge that'll cut the wind. Wait there." "For how long?" "An hour. If I'm not back in an hour." "If you're not back in an hour, I have 2 children and a long way to go to Cutter's Creek." "I understand." He looked at her for a moment, not arguing, not trying to explain it differently. Just looking the way you looked at someone when you were committing their face to memory in case you needed it later. "Don't let Henry feed Ash any more grain," he said. "She's had enough for today. She'll be fine." "I know. It's Henry I'm worried about. He'll decide she needs more." Despite everything, Della almost smiled. "Go." He went. She took the children to the rocks and waited. Ruth sat close to her and didn't talk, which was how Della knew her daughter was scared. Ruth talked when she was nervous and went silent when she was genuinely frightened. Henry fell asleep against Della's side within 20 minutes because Henry had the extraordinary gift of being able to sleep when the world was uncertain, which Della had alternately envied and worried about since the day he was born. 40 minutes. 50. "Mama," Ruth said. "I know." "What do we do if—" "I know, Ruth." At 58 minutes, she heard hoofbeats. Cole came back around the south side of the ridge at a controlled canter, and the fact that it was controlled and not a gallop told her before she could read his face that the immediate crisis was past. He pulled Ash up and looked at her, and she could see it in the set of his mouth, the particular tightness of a man who had seen something and was deciding how much to say. "Not him," Cole said. "Homesteaders, family of 4, they're fine." He paused. "But Soul came through there 2 days ago. They hid when they saw him. Said he was riding west toward the Cutter's Creek Pass." Della felt the information settle. "Same direction as us?" "Yes." "How far ahead?" 2 days. Maybe less if he had to stop in the storm that hit last night. That weather went west before it went anywhere else." Della looked at her sleeping son, at her daughter's careful, controlled face. She thought about the family that had hidden when they'd seen a dangerous man ride past, about the fact that she had been doing the same thing for months in a different way, hiding in plain sight, making herself quiet and small and unthreatening, so the world's dangerous men would look past her and keep moving. "We need to get to Cutter's Creek before he does," she said. Cole looked at her steadily. "We need to be careful. Those are not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "They're not." He looked at Henry, still sleeping against her side, at Ruth sitting straight-backed and listening. "What I'm saying is that we should travel together through the pass. All of us. The family back there said there's a narrow stretch 2 days out where a man alone could be watched without knowing it. You want us with you for the same reason I let you travel with us. Better odds." "Yes." "You're not pretending it's anything else?" "No, ma'am." Ruth looked at Della with that particular expression that meant she had already decided and was waiting for Della to catch up. Della woke Henry with a gentle hand on his shoulder. He came awake the way he always did, not gradually, but all at once, like a lamp being lit. "Are we going?" he asked. "We're going." Is Cole coming? He's coming. Henry looked over at Cole with the calm satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been confirmed. Good, he said. He slid off Della's lap and went to find his hat, which he'd dropped somewhere in the rocks. And Della stood and looked at Cole Hargrove in the failing afternoon light, and understood something that she didn't particularly want to understand yet. He was a good man. Not the kind of good that men performed when they wanted something, the exaggerated courtesy that was really just another form of pressure. The real kind. The quiet kind that showed itself in the way he'd let Henry adjust to his own pace, in the way he'd taken her parallel track offer without making it into something she owed him, in the fact that he'd told her the truth about Soul's direction, even knowing that the truth complicated everything. She didn't want to understand that yet, because understanding it meant beginning to trust it, and trusting things had cost her more than she currently had available to spend. But the road was long, and the pass was narrow, and there was a dangerous man somewhere ahead of them in the snow. She saddled up. They made camp that night earlier than Della would have pushed, and she knew it was because of the children, because Cole had looked at Henry's face in the last hour of riding and seen what she saw. The particular gray tinge around the eyes that meant a child was past tired and heading somewhere that took longer to come back from. She cooked what she had, which wasn't much. Dried beans stretched with a handful of wild onion that Ruth had spotted pushing through the snow at the creek bank, something Della hadn't asked her to do, but that Ruth had done anyway because Ruth paid attention. A flat bread cooked in the pan. Not the food she could make when she had a proper kitchen and proper ingredients. Not the food she was capable of. But Cole ate it with the same full attention he'd given to last night's stew, and Henry asked for seconds, and Ruth cleaned her plate without being asked. After the children were down, Cole sat across the fire and looked at her. "You said they let you go in October," he said. "I did. You had a job and a place, and they took it from you because of how you look, and 2 months later you're out here in the middle of November with 2 children trying to get to a town where you've never been to ask for a job from a man you've never met." That's an accurate summary of the situation. That takes... He stopped, started again. Most people would have stayed, found something smaller, settled. I know. Della looked into the fire. My children are watching what I do when the world tells me to settle. I told you that already. I know you did. I'm saying it back to you because it deserves to be said back. He was quiet for a moment. My mother worked herself to the bone for 20 years in a laundry in Kansas City. She was better at her job than any man in that town was at his, and she never once got paid what she was worth, and she never once complained about it because she was afraid of losing what little she had. He turned a stick over in his hands. I used to think that was strength. Now I think it was what happens when a person runs out of options and decides that endurance is the same as dignity. Della looked at him directly. It is sometimes. And sometimes it's not. No, sometimes it's not. She pulled her coat tighter. The difference is whether you're enduring on the way to somewhere or just enduring. Which are you doing? Enduring on the way somewhere, she said. I intend to get to Cutter's Creek, and I intend to walk into the Sentinel Hotel, and I intend to cook that man 1 meal. 1. And after that meal, he'll have 2 choices. Give me the job, or explain to himself for the rest of his life why he didn't. Cole looked at her across the fire for a long moment, and there was something in his face that was not pity, and was not admiration exactly. It was more like recognition. The particular look of a person who has found something in someone else that answers a question they didn't know they'd been asking. I believe you, he said simply. Della looked away from him and back at the fire because she needed to look somewhere else for a moment. She had been told that she was capable and determined and impressive enough times by enough people for her to know that it was true, and also to know that it didn't change a single thing about the way the world received her when she walked through a door. Cole saying, I believe you, was different. She couldn't yet explain why. She wasn't ready to try. Get some sleep, she said. You've got first watch tonight. I actually mean it this time. Yes, ma'am. He stood, and his shadow moved across the snow, long and quiet. Della. She looked up. Those are good children you're raising. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. They're the best thing I ever did. He moved to take his watch, and she lay down close to her sleeping children and pulled the blanket around all three of them. Ruth's back against her chest, Henry's warmth at her knees. She lay still and listened to the fire and the wind and the quiet sound of a man keeping watch who was not her husband and not her family and not anything she had a category for yet. The cold came down from the mountains and pressed against everything it touched. Della Voss closed her eyes and let tomorrow be tomorrow. They found the body on the morning of the third day. Cole saw it first. He pulled Ash up hard and turned in the saddle and looked at Della with an expression that told her everything before he said a word. She reached back and put her hand on Ruth's arm. Take Henry and ride back to those rocks we passed, she said quietly. The big ones. Wait there. Mama. Ruth. Ruth looked at her mother's face and heard what was underneath the word, and turned her horse without another argument. Della listened to the hoofbeats move away before she rode up alongside Cole. It was a man, or had been. He was lying face down in the snow at the edge of the tree line, and the snow around him told a story that Della didn't want to read, but couldn't stop reading anyway. The signs of a struggle. Drag marks. A single horse's tracks leading west. Soul, she asked. No. Cole had dismounted and was crouched a few feet away, not touching anything, just reading the ground, the way he read everything quietly and with complete attention. This is one of Soul's. The boots are wrong for the man the homesteaders described. He stood up. Soul killed his own partner. Della sat still on her horse and let that settle. Why? She asked. Because the pass is 2 days out, and whatever he's carrying, he's decided one share is better than two. Cole came back to Ash and swung up. His jaw was set in the particular way it got when he was containing something that wanted to expand. He's alone now. That makes him faster. It also makes him more dangerous. How does alone make a man more dangerous? Because he's got nothing left to lose and nobody left to talk him down. He looked at her directly. I need to push ahead. I need to get to the pass before he does, and I can't do that at the pace we've been keeping with the children. Della looked at him. She understood what he was saying. She also understood what he wasn't saying, which was that he didn't want to leave them. How far to the next settlement? She asked. 12 miles east. There's a trading post called Harmon's. It's nothing much, but it's solid, and the man who runs it is decent. You'd be safe there. 12 miles east is 12 miles away from Cutter's Creek. Yes. That's 2 days of ground I've already covered. I know. Della looked west toward the pass she couldn't see yet, and east toward safety she didn't want. She thought about Ruth and Henry back at the rocks waiting for her, about the way Henry had pressed close to her last night when the wind got loud, about the way Ruth had stopped talking again this morning, which meant she was frightened again. She thought about Cutter's Creek, about the Sentinel Hotel, about Harlan Webb, who was building something ambitious and needed a kitchen to match. She thought about the woman she was trying to be in front of her children every single day. We'll come with you to the pass, she said. Cole looked at her. Della. Not because I don't understand the risk. Because turning back 12 miles with 2 children in this cold is its own risk, and I won't do it for a threat that's speculative when I have a destination that's certain. She held his gaze. You stay close. You watch the western approach. I handle my children. We move together, and we move fast. Agreed. He was quiet for a long moment. If I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to take the children and ride, you ride, and you don't look back. Agreed. I mean it, Della. You ride and you don't look back. I heard you the first time. He looked at her for one more second, and she could see him running the calculation, checking it against everything he knew about terrain and danger, and the particular mathematics of protecting people you'd started to care about before you meant to. All right, he said. Let's go get the children. They moved fast after that. Cole set a pace that was harder than anything they'd managed before. Not brutal, but unrelenting, the kind of pace that ate ground and didn't apologize for it. Ruth matched it without complaint. Henry flagged once around mid-morning, and Cole dropped back without a word, and rode alongside him for a stretch, talking to him about something Della couldn't hear from the front, and whatever he said made Henry straighten up and push Bear forward with renewed purpose. She didn't ask what he'd said. She filed it away in the place where she kept things she wasn't ready to examine yet. The pass came into view around noon. It was narrower than Della had imagined, a cut between two ridges, where the walls came close enough that 3 riders couldn't go through abreast. The snow at the entrance was churned and recent. Someone had come through here within the last 12 hours. Cole pulled up and studied it for a long time. "He went through," he said. "How long ago?" "This morning, early." He was reading the tracks with the focused intensity he brought to everything dangerous. "He's not waiting inside. He kept moving." "How do you know he's not waiting?" "Because if he was planning to ambush from inside the pass, he'd have stopped his horse before the entrance and gone in on foot. These tracks don't stop." He turned to look at her. "We go through fast, and we go through in the middle. Don't let the children ride close to either wall." "Understood." Ruth had come up alongside Della. Her face was the careful blank she wore when she was keeping herself together by main force. "Is it dangerous?" she asked Cole. He looked at her with the directness he always gave her, the directness that treated her as someone whose questions deserved real answers. "It could be," he said, "but I think it's all right. We're going to go through quickly and stay together. Your job is to keep Bear moving and your eyes forward. Can you do that?" "Yes," Ruth said. "Henry." Cole turned to the boy. "You're going to ride right behind your mother. Ash knows what to do. You just stay low and hold on. Think you can manage?" Henry straightened up in the saddle with the effortful dignity of a 6-year-old being asked to be brave. "Yes, sir." "Good man." They went through. The walls came up on either side, and the world narrowed to a strip of white ground and pale sky, and the sound of hooves and Della's own heartbeat, and the breathing of her children behind her. She kept her eyes forward, and her horse moving, and counted seconds without meaning to, because counting was the thing her mind did when her body was frightened, and she refused to let it show. 1 minute. 2. The far end of the pass opened up in front of them like a door swinging wide, and they came through into open terrain, and Della breathed again. Cole was the last one through. He came out of the pass and brought Ash around in a wide arc, checking the ridgelines, checking the tree line to the south, checking everything with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that the absence of visible danger was not the same as safety. Then he looked at Della, and his shoulders dropped half an inch. "We're through," he said. Ruth let out a breath that she'd been holding so long it came out ragged. Henry made a sound that was not quite a word and reached forward to pat Ash on the neck. "You did good," Cole told Henry. "I was scared," Henry said, with the matter-of-fact honesty of a child who hadn't yet learned to be ashamed of the truth. "So was I," Cole said. "Scared and brave aren't opposites. They happen at the same time." Henry considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Like Mama," he said. Cole looked at Della. She was already looking ahead at the western horizon and the land that was starting to open up into the foothills that meant Cutter's Creek was real and getting closer, and she didn't turn around because she didn't want him to see her face right at that moment. "Yeah," she heard Cole say quietly. "Exactly like your mama." They stopped to rest the horses an hour past the pass in a hollow where the wind dropped, and the afternoon sun had actual warmth in it for the first time in days. Della unpacked the last of her real food, the last biscuits, the last dried apple, a small piece of cured pork that she'd been saving. She laid it out and looked at it and did the arithmetic one more time. "That's everything," Cole said. He wasn't asking. "We'll reach Cutter's Creek tomorrow if we make good time today." She divided the food without hesitating. Children first the largest portions to them. We'll be fine. I've got 2 more strips of jerky. Keep them. You may need them before this is over. She handed Ruth her plate, and Ruth took it, and then looked at her mother's portion, and then looked back up. Mama, yours is smaller. Mine is fine. It's smaller than everyone else's. Ruth, I'm not going to pretend I don't see it. You don't have to pretend. Della met her daughter's eyes. I'm an adult. I can manage on less. You're growing. End of discussion. Ruth held her mother's gaze for a long moment, with the fierce, particular love of a child who understood sacrifice and resented it, and was grateful for it all at once. Then she ate her food. Cole ate his jerky without comment, and gave his biscuit to Henry when Henry finished his own, and looked at the empty plate with the expression of a small boy who was still hungry and was too proud to say so. He did it without making anything of it, just placed the biscuit on Henry's plate while he was looking the other direction. And when Henry looked back down and found it there, he looked around trying to figure out where it had come from, and Cole was already looking at the horizon, like he'd forgotten the biscuit existed. Della saw all of this and said nothing. They were back on the trail within the hour, and it was in that stretch of riding with the afternoon going golden around them, and Cutter's Creek somewhere in the distance ahead, that Ruth came up alongside Cole and said the thing she'd clearly been building toward all day. Are you going to leave when we get there? Ruth asked him. To go after your man. That's the plan, Cole said. And then what? Then I take him back to stand for what he did. Ruth was quiet for a moment, processing this. What if he's already in Cutter's Creek? What if he's there when we get there? Then I deal with it there. What does deal with it mean? It means I handle it so nobody else has to. Ruth absorbed this. Then, what do you do after you've dealt with it? Cole rode for a moment without answering. Della could see him deciding between the easy answer and the true one. She knew which one Ruth would accept. I don't know yet, he said finally. I've been asking myself that question for a while now. Ruth nodded as though this confirmed something. You don't have anywhere to go back to, she said. That's what I thought. Ruth, Della said. I'm not being rude. I'm being accurate. Ruth looked at Cole with the frank assessment that she delivered to everyone, regardless of their feelings about it. You've been a deputy for how long? 6 years. And before that, Army. 3 years. And before that, my mother's house until I was 17. Then I left. Why did you leave? Because staying felt like giving up on something I hadn't found yet. Ruth thought about this. Did you find it? Cole was quiet for long enough that Della glanced over at him. He was looking at the trail ahead, with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between recognition and reluctance, like a man arriving somewhere he hadn't known he was heading. I'm starting to think, he said carefully, that finding it and finding somewhere to put down roots might be the same thing. Ruth let that answer sit for exactly the amount of time she gave all answers before rendering judgment. Then she moved her horse back to ride beside Henry, which was Ruth's way of declaring that the interview was over and she was satisfied with the results. The afternoon wore on, and the light went sideways and golden and cold, and Cutter's Creek appeared in the valley below them just as the sun hit the ridge line. It was bigger than Della had let herself hope. Not a settlement, not a collection of temporary buildings waiting to fall over in the next hard wind, but an actual town with streets and structures built to last. She could see the Sentinel Hotel from the ridge, 3 stories new timber, still pale lights already burning in the upper windows. Smoke from a dozen chimneys rising straight up into the cold, clear air. Ruth came up beside her without speaking, and they looked at it together, mother and daughter. There it is, Ruth said finally. There it is. Are you scared? Della looked at the town, at the hotel, at the thing she'd been riding toward for 2 months through wilderness and cold and loss, and the particular terror of not knowing whether the ground you were standing on was solid or ice underneath. Yes, she said. Good. Ruth's voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had thought this through carefully. Because you said being scared and being brave happen at the same time. Della looked at her daughter, 9 years old and already carrying more wisdom than most people accumulated in a lifetime. She reached over and put her hand briefly on the back of Ruth's neck, the way she had when Ruth was small enough to hold. I did say that, she said. They started down toward town. It was Cole who saw the horse first. He pulled up so suddenly that Ash skidded in the snow, and Della felt the alarm travel through her before she even understood its source. That horse, Cole said very quietly. The gray roan tied in front of the saloon. You see it? Della looked. A horse she didn't recognize. What about it? The homesteaders described Sol's horse to me. Gray roan with a torn left ear. His voice had gone flat and even in the way it went when he was thinking fast and keeping the thinking contained. That's the horse. The air changed. Della felt it, the particular charge that came before something broke. He's in there, Cole said. In that saloon. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were direct and completely calm in the way that made her understand that underneath the calm was something that was not calm at all, but that he had a long time ago decided to put on a very short leash. I need you to take the children to the hotel, the Sentinel. Go to the front desk. Tell them you're applying for the kitchen position and stay inside until I come for you. Cole. Della. His voice was not sharp. It was the opposite of sharp. It was quiet and certain, and it carried the full weight of a man who was asking her to trust him with the one thing she trusted no one with. I need to know you and those children are inside a solid building before I walk through that door. I can't do my job if I'm thinking about where you are. She looked at him. She looked at Ruth, who was listening with the stillness of a child who understood that this was the moment that mattered. She looked at Henry, who had Ash's reins in both hands and was watching Cole with a trust so uncomplicated and complete that it made her chest ache. 1 hour, she said. You have 1 hour before I send someone to find you. That's fair. It's not negotiable. I know. He looked at her for a moment longer, and there was something in it that went past practical, past the arrangements of two people managing a dangerous situation together. He looked at her the way people looked at things they were afraid of losing. Go, he said. I'll come find you. He turned Ash toward the saloon. Della watched him for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to acknowledge what she was feeling, and short enough that she didn't have to name it, and then she turned to her children. We're going to the hotel, she said. Sit up straight, both of you. Ruth lifted her chin. Henry straightened his back. They rode down the main street of Cutter's Creek in the last light of the afternoon. 3 people who had come through 2 months of wilderness and grief and cold and doubt, and Della Voss did not look back at the saloon, and she did not look back at the man riding toward it. She kept her eyes on the Sentinel Hotel, and she kept riding forward, because that was what she had always done, and that was what she intended to keep doing. And whatever waited on the other side of those doors, she was going to meet it standing up. The Sentinel Hotel smelled like fresh lumber and ambition. Della walked through the front door with Ruth on her left and Henry on her right, and her chin level and her coat still carrying 2 months of trail dust, and she did not apologize for any of it. The lobby was warm and lit and populated by the kind of people who had money and knew how to arrange themselves to show it. 2 men in good suits near the window. A woman at the far end in a dress that cost more than Della had made in her last 3 months at the Grand Continental. A clerk behind the front desk who looked up when she entered and let his eyes travel over her in the practiced half-second assessment that she had stopped being surprised by years ago. She crossed the lobby before he could decide what to do with his assessment. I'm here to speak with the manager about the kitchen position, she said. My name is Della Voss. The clerk was young and uncertain in the way that young, uncertain people were looking for a category to put her in and not finding the right one. The kitchen position has been, we've had several applicants. I understand. I'd still like to speak with the manager. "Ma'am, the dinner service begins in 2 hours and Mr. Webb is—" "Then I won't take much of his time." She held the clerk's gaze with the particular patience of a woman who had learned that patience deployed correctly was more effective than force. "My name is Della Voss. I've been head cook at the Grand Continental Hotel in Billings for 4 years. I've traveled 2 months through the Montana Highlands in November to get here. I would like 5 minutes with the manager." The clerk looked at her. He looked at Ruth, who was standing with her arms at her sides and her expression composed. He looked at Henry, who was looking at the chandelier above the lobby with undisguised wonder. "I'll see if he's available," the clerk said, and went. Ruth moved close to Della's side. "Good," she murmured. "Don't celebrate yet." "I'm not celebrating. I'm noting that it went better than it could have." Henry pulled his attention from the chandelier. "Is Cole coming?" he asked. "He'll come when he's done what he needs to do." Della put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "Don't ask me again. I'll tell you when I know." Henry nodded and went back to looking at the chandelier. She watched the clock above the front desk. 15 minutes had passed since they'd ridden down the main street. 45 minutes left in the hour she'd given Cole. She knew what she was doing. She knew she was counting tracking, keeping one part of her attention on a man in a saloon 300 yards away, while the other part of her attention managed the most important professional moment of her life. She resented needing to know how much time had passed. She did it anyway. The manager appeared from a door behind the desk, and Della understood immediately what she was dealing with. Harlan Webb was a man who had built something and knew it, and wore that knowledge on the outside of himself where everyone could see it. He was in his 50s, well-dressed, the kind of man who assessed people the way he assessed building materials for quality, for utility, for whether they'd hold up under pressure. He came around the desk and stopped in front of her and looked at her the way the clerk had looked at her that same traveling assessment, but slower and more experienced and significantly harder to read. "Mrs. Voss?" he said. "Miss Voss?" "Miss Voss." He corrected himself without embarrassment, which she noted. "Thomas tells me you've come about the kitchen." "I have. We filled that position 2 weeks ago." The floor did not drop out from under her. She had spent 2 months in the wilderness practicing the art of not letting the floor drop out from under her, and she employed that practice now. "What happened to the person you hired?" she asked. Something moved in Webb's face. "He left 3 days ago." He paused. He was not equal to the demands of the position. "I am." Webb looked at her. She could see him running through the same calculation the clerk had run, the same one every man in every establishment she'd ever walked into had run, overlaying what she looked like against what she was claiming to be capable of, and finding the two things difficult to reconcile. "You came from the Grand Continental in Billings," he said. "For 4 years, head cook. Why did you leave?" Della had prepared for this question in the way she prepared for all difficult things, by deciding in advance what the truth was and committing to it. "They decided I wasn't the right presentation for the dining room. The owner's wife objected to my appearance. I was given the choice to accept a reduced role away from public view or leave. I left." Webb was quiet for a moment. She couldn't tell if the honesty helped or hurt. She had decided she didn't care which lying to get a job was just building a foundation on ice, and she'd worked too hard and traveled too far to start on ice. "What can you cook?" he asked. "Anything you need me to cook. French service home cooking, game preparation, baked goods, preserving, anything requiring a Dutch oven over an open fire." She paused deliberately. "That last one I've been practicing for the past 2 months." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "You cooked in the field. I cooked for my children and a half-dead lawman in the Montana Highlands in November. The meals were good. The lawman can verify this. He can, when he's finished with the business that brought him to your town." She held Webb's gaze. In the meantime, I can verify it myself. Give me your kitchen for 30 minutes and whatever you have on hand. One dish. After that, you can make your decision with actual information instead of whatever assumptions you're currently working from. Webb studied her for a long moment. She could feel Ruth next to her still, and controlled radiating the kind of focused, silent support that a 9-year-old had no business being capable of, but that Ruth had always been capable of. My dinner service starts in 2 hours, he said. Then you should decide quickly. Another long moment. Then, Margaret will take your children to the sitting room. They'll be warm and fed. He turned without waiting for her response. Come with me. The kitchen was bigger than she'd expected and better equipped than she'd hoped, and Della felt something happen in her chest when she walked through the door that she recognized as the specific feeling of being in exactly the right place. She had felt it for the first time at 14 years old in her grandmother's kitchen on a Sunday morning, and she had spent every year since then working toward getting it back, and she had it now. She took off her coat and rolled up her sleeves and looked at what was available. There was a cook already in the kitchen, a young man named Elias, who looked at her with the uncertain expression of someone who didn't know whether she was competition or reinforcement. She looked at him long enough to take his measure. Competent, nervous-trained, but not inspired. And then she said, "What do you have in the cold store?" he told her. "And the pantry," he told her. She thought for exactly as long as she needed to think, which was not long. "I'm going to make you something," she said. "You're going to watch, and you're going to help when I ask for help, and you're not going to ask why I'm doing things the way I'm doing them. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. She started to cook. What came out of the next 30 minutes was not the most complex thing she'd ever made. She didn't have the time or the full range of supplies for complex. What she made was a braised short rib with the bone-in finished with a pan sauce that she built from the fond, and a cup of the red wine she found in the back of the pantry, and a handful of dried herbs that smelled like they'd been there a while, but still had life in them. She made a potato cake alongside it, fried in the pan drippings. She plated it on the hotel's good china with the instinctive sense of presentation she'd developed over 20 years of making other people's food worth looking at. She handed the plates to Harlan Webb without ceremony. He looked at it for a moment. Then he cut into the rib. Then he tasted it. Della stood with her hands at her sides and watched his face and showed him nothing. He ate the entire portion without speaking. He ate the potato cake. He set the fork down and looked at her, and then looked at the plate, and then looked back at her. "What would you do differently with more time?" he asked. "I'd break down my own short ribs rather than using pre-cut. I'd source fresher herbs. I'd adjust the sauce reduction by about 4 minutes." She paused. "The fundamentals stand." "The fundamentals stand," he repeated in the tone of a man tasting a phrase he was considering keeping. He looked at Elias. Well, Elias had tasted the sauce at Della's invitation halfway through the process, and his face had done something then that it was still doing now, a complicated rearrangement of everything he'd thought he knew about what he was capable of learning. "It's the best thing I've eaten in 6 months," he said with the honesty of someone who had given up trying to sound professional. Webb looked at Della. "My previous head cook was trained in Chicago. He charged me accordingly and delivered inconsistently." He folded his hands. "What do you need? A fair wage, a say in the menu, the authority to run my kitchen without interference." She held his gaze. "And I need it understood from the beginning that my children are with me. They won't be in the kitchen during service. They won't be a disruption. But they are with me, and that is not subject to negotiation." Webb was quiet for a moment. Della did not fill the silence. "The wage I can meet," he said finally. "The menu I can discuss. The authority in the kitchen you have earned by that plate." He looked at her steadily. "The children, I have a room in the back of the hotel that's been used for storage. It can be made into something livable. My wife will have opinions about that, which I will manage. That's my concern, not yours. Something released in Della's chest. Something that had been clenched for 2 months. She breathed in. "We have a deal, Mr. Webb," she said. "We have the beginning of one Miss Voss. The terms in full we'll discuss tomorrow morning." He stood. "Tonight, I need a kitchen. Can you start tonight?" "I need 20 minutes." "For what?" "To check on my children, and to find out whether the man I traveled here with is still alive." Webb looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, and settled somewhere between the two. 20 minutes, he said. She found Henry in the sitting room, asleep in an armchair with his boots still on, which was so completely Henry that she stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at him. Ruth was sitting at the small table with a cup of something hot. And when Della came in, Ruth looked up and read her face in the 1-second way she'd always been able to read her mother's face. "You got it," Ruth said. "I got it." Ruth put her cup down. Her chin trembled once, just once, and then stopped. "I knew you would," she said. "I knew it. Don't cry. If you cry, I'll cry, and I have to go cook dinner for 50 people. "I'm not crying." Ruth pressed her fingers to the corners of her eyes. "I'm not." "I know." Della sat down across from her daughter and took both her hands across the table. "We have a room here, a real room, warm inside. You and Henry are safe tonight." Ruth held her mother's hands very tightly. She was 9 years old, and she had crossed the Montana highlands in November and slept on frozen ground and ridden through a mountain pass with a dangerous man somewhere ahead of them. And she had not once in all of that asked her mother whether they were going to be all right. She had known that asking the question out loud was a weight Della didn't need to carry. "Are we going to be all right?" she asked now, just the once, quietly. "Yes," Della said. "We are going to be all right." Ruth nodded. She squeezed her mother's hands once more and let go. "Go find Cole," she said. "He's been in that saloon too long." She was right. Della had been counting. 53 minutes. She came out of the Sentinel Hotel into the cold evening air and turned toward the saloon, and she was 12 feet from the door when it opened and Cole Hargrove walked out. He was upright. He was walking. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that was still seeping and a tear in the shoulder of his coat that had not been there this morning, and he was favoring his right side in a way that meant either bruised ribs or something worse. He saw her and stopped. She stopped. They stood on the main street of Cutter's Creek in the gathering dark, with lamps being lit in windows all around them, and looked at each other for a moment without speaking. "Soul," she asked. "In custody. Sheriff's got him." He touched the cut above his eye almost absently, the way a man touched something that hurt, and had already decided not to make anything of it. He didn't come quietly. "I can see that." The other thing was worse than the ribs. The other thing was the moment when I walked through that door, and the first thing I thought about was not the job I came here to do, but whether you and those children were inside a solid building. He said it without looking away from her. That was new. Della looked at him. "Cole? I'm not asking for anything. I'm telling you the truth because you're the kind of person who deserves the truth told straight." He exhaled. "I came to Cutter's Creek to do a job. The job is done. I don't have anywhere I need to be after this." "I know," she said. "I know you know. I'm saying it out loud because leaving without saying it seemed like the wrong thing, and I've done enough wrong things to know how they feel." She looked at him for a long moment. At the cut above his eye and the torn shoulder and the way he was standing slightly off-center to protect the ribs that were almost certainly cracked, and at the way his face was open and quiet and waiting, not pushing, not asking for anything except the honesty he'd just offered her. "Henry asked about you every hour for the last 2 days, she said. "Did he?" "Ruth conducted a full interview on the trail this afternoon. I believe you passed." Something moved in his face. "What were the criteria?" whether you had somewhere to be after this mostly, and whether you were the kind of man who would give a child his biscuit without making it into something the child needed to feel grateful for. Cole was quiet. She saw that, he said. Ruth sees everything. Della took a breath. I got the job. I start tonight. We have a room. I'm glad. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it without qualification or condition. Mr. Webb will need someone to handle difficulties that arise in a growing establishment. Town is expanding fast. The kind of men that brings through are not all the kind of men you want near a hotel full of people who've worked hard for what they have. She held his gaze. It's not tracking outlaws through the highlands. It's mostly boring. Occasionally it's not. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Are you offering me a job? I'm stating facts about a situation and allowing you to draw your own conclusions. The corner of his mouth moved. That's not what that is. That's what I'm calling it. He was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them, a wagon passing two men heading into the general store, a woman calling to someone from an upstairs window, the ordinary noise of a town that was becoming itself. I'll need to take Soul back to Billings for trial, he said. That's 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'll be here when you get back. You sure about that? Della looked at him with the full weight of a woman who had crossed 2 months of wilderness on a promise she'd made to herself and her children, and had just walked into a hotel kitchen and made it true. I said it, she said. That means it's true. Cole looked at her, and the thing in his face that she'd been refusing to name since the first night at the fire was there again, clear and steady, and not going anywhere. Then I'll be back, he said. He tipped his hat, the old-fashioned gesture that meant something real when it came from a man who wasn't performing it, and turned toward the sheriff's office. Della watched him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back toward the Sentinel Hotel and the kitchen that was waiting for her, and the 50 people who were going to sit down to dinner in 2 hours and not yet know that their lives were about to get incrementally better, and she walked through the front door with her head up and her shoulders square. Elias was waiting for her in the kitchen doorway. Ready? He asked. She tied her apron strings behind her back with the quick, certain motion of a woman doing the thing she was made to do. I've been ready for 2 months, she said. Let's cook. The first dinner service at the Sentinel Hotel under Della Voss lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. She did not sleep afterward. She sat in the small back room that Harlan Webb had cleared of storage crates and made into something livable, a real bed for the children, a cot for herself, a washstand, a window that looked out over the stable yard, and she listened to Ruth and Henry breathe, and she let the silence work on her. The way silence worked when you had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had finally, for the first time, set it down. The service had gone well. Better than well. Elias had been a good partner once he stopped being surprised by her, and started paying attention to what she was doing and why. 2 of the dining room servers had come back to the kitchen after the last table cleared, which servers almost never did, and one of them had said simply, "Ma'am, whatever you did to that sauce, please don't ever stop doing it," and the other had just nodded with the solemnity of a person confirming a religious experience. Harlan Webb had found her during the brief lull between the second and third seatings and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the controlled motion of her and Elias and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "My wife wants to meet you tomorrow." And then he went back out to the dining room, which was the most unambiguous positive response she had received from an employer in 4 years. She lay on her cot in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and thought about Cole Hargrove somewhere on the road back to Billings with a man in custody and cracked ribs and whatever it was he carried that he'd never fully named. She thought about the way he'd tipped his hat before he left, that old gesture that meant something real. She thought about Ruth's interview on the trail, the systematic way her daughter had assessed a man she'd known for 3 days, against criteria that a 9-year-old had somehow already developed. She thought about Henry giving Cole back his hat the morning after the pass. the small, solemn presentation of a child who understood that objects could carry gratitude when words weren't enough. She thought about what it cost to let people matter. She had paid that cost before had paid it fully, and she knew what the invoice looked like when it came due. Thomas had been sick for 2 years before the end. 2 years of watching a man diminish by degrees of keeping the household running and the children stable, and her own fear somewhere in a room inside herself with the door closed because there was no one else to keep the door closed. After he died, she had closed more doors. Not from bitterness, from the arithmetic of a woman who understood that she only had so many rooms, and that some of them needed to stay locked so the others could stay open. Cole Hargrove was standing outside one of those locked rooms and not asking her to open it. He was just standing there, patient and straight and present in the way that some people were present, the way that filled a space without crowding it. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. She fell asleep before she found the answer, which was probably the right outcome. 3 weeks passed. Della cooked. She cooked breakfast and lunch and dinner, and she cooked the private suppers that Webb's wealthiest guests requested, and she cooked the staff meal every evening because she had learned early that a kitchen ran on the morale of the people in it, and the morale of the people in it ran on whether they felt seen. She cooked Elias into a better version of himself, which he was grateful for, in the inarticulate way of young men who don't yet have the vocabulary for gratitude, but mean it genuinely. She hired a woman named Clara, who had been cooking for a mining camp 15 miles east, and who arrived at the kitchen door one Tuesday morning and said, "I heard you were building something. I want to be part of it." Della hired her on the spot after watching her break down a chicken in 40 seconds with a knife she'd sharpened herself. Ruth went to the school that had been recently established in a building on 4th Street. She came home the first day and reported with the careful neutrality of someone managing her response to new information that the teacher was adequate and the other children were adjusting to her, which meant they had tried to establish a social order that Ruth found wanting and had restructured it to her satisfaction. Henry made a friend on the second day, a boy named Marcus, whose father ran the feed store, and began disappearing into the town, with the easy confidence of a child who had learned in the hard school of the trail that the world was navigable if you paid attention. Della watched her children become themselves in Cutter's Creek, and it was the best thing she had seen in a long time. Webb's wife Eleanor was a small, precise woman who wore her intelligence the way she wore her clothes, deliberately and with attention to effect. She came to the kitchen on the second morning after the first service, sat down at the work table without being invited, and watched Della work for 40 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "My husband has not gotten anything this right in 3 years of building this hotel." She stood up. "I'll be back tomorrow." She came back every morning for a week. On the 7th morning she said, "What do you need that you don't have?" And Della told her exactly without softening or qualification, and Eleanor Webb wrote it down and had most of it sourced within 10 days. They were not friends, not yet, but they were something more durable than friendly. They were two women who understood each other's competence and had the sense to respect it. On the morning of the 22nd day, Della was in the kitchen breaking down a side of venison that one of the local hunters had brought in, when she heard Henry's voice in the hallway outside, louder than his indoor voice, which meant he was excited about something. And then the kitchen door opened, and Henry came in at a pace that was just barely short of running with Ruth 3 steps behind him. "He's back," Henry said. Della set down her knife. She wiped her hands on her apron with the deliberate care of a woman who was making herself take an extra 3 seconds before she responded to anything. "Did you speak to him?" "He spoke to us," Ruth said from the doorway. "We were coming back from school. He was on the main street." She paused. "He looks better. The cut healed. And the ribs. He's not favoring his side anymore." Ruth delivered this with the clinical accuracy of someone who had been watching for exactly that detail. "He asked if you were here. I told him you were in the kitchen. He said he'd come by this evening if that was all right." "That's all right," Della said. Henry was looking at her with the focused, hopeful attention of a child who had already drawn conclusions and was waiting for the adults to catch up. "Mama," he said. "Henry. Is he going to stay?" Della looked at her son. 6 years old, and already asking the questions that went straight to the center of things. She thought about what Cole had said on the main street 3 weeks ago. "I'll be here when you get back." I said it. That means it's true. "I don't know yet," she said. "But we're going to have a conversation about it tonight like adults, and whatever comes out of that conversation will be honest, and it will be the truth. That's what I can promise you." Henry considered this. "Okay," he said, with the particular serenity of a child who trusted his mother's word enough to wait on it. Cole came to the hotel at 7, after the second service had wound down, and the kitchen staff had gone home, and Elias had banked the stove with the careful competence that meant Della had taught him something real. She was still in the kitchen when he knocked on the doorframe, and she turned and saw him standing there, with his hat in his hands, and the cut above his eye healed to a thin line, and his coat mended at the shoulder by what looked like his own stitching, which was not elegant, but was thorough. "The service go well?" he asked. "It always goes well." She gestured at the table. "Sit down, there's food." "You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to." She turned back to the stove and ladled out 2 bowls of the short rib braise she'd been refining for 3 weeks, the dish she'd made for Webb the first day, but better now, closer to what it wanted to be. She put them on the table and sat down across from him and looked at him directly. "How are the ribs?" she asked. "Healed." "The cut?" "Fine." "Soul?" "Delivered. Stood before the magistrate in Billings 2 weeks ago. They'll hang him in the spring." He said it flat, without satisfaction or regret, the tone of a man who had completed something that needed completing and was not going to perform feelings about it. "And your badge?" "Sheriff Morrison offered it back. Said the county needed men like me, and it had been an unofficial leave of absence as far as he was concerned." "Did you take it back?" Cole looked at her across the table. "I told him I was considering a different position." Della held his gaze. "In Cutter's Creek. If it's available. Webb needs someone to handle the security of a growing establishment. Town is expanding. He's been using whoever's available when trouble comes up, and it's not a system that works long-term." She picked up her spoon. "I may have mentioned your name. You may have. He may have already spoken to the sheriff here, who may have already spoken to Morrison, who apparently had very specific and positive things to say about your character and your judgment." Cole looked at her for a moment. "You did all of that while I was gone." "I did all of that while I was cooking 32 dinners and overseeing 2 breakfast services a day and helping Ruth with her arithmetic and teaching Henry that the stable cats are not his personal property." She met his eyes. "I'm efficient." Something moved in his face that was warm and real and not contained the way he usually contained things. "Della, I'm not going to pretend I didn't want you to come back," she said. "I'm not built for pretending. I tried it for years, and it cost me too much." She set her spoon down. "I'm also not going to pretend I know what this is yet, or where it goes, or whether 2 people who met over a Dutch oven in the Montana Highlands in November have any business building something together." "No," he said. "Neither am I. What I know is that my children trust you. Ruth does not give that easily. Henry gives it too easily, so his opinion alone doesn't count, but in combination with Ruth's, it carries weight." She looked at him steadily. "And I know that you did not once in the 2 months we've known each other treat me like a problem that needed solving, or a woman who needed managing, or someone whose worth was up for debate based on what I looked like. That's not a high bar," he said quietly. "No, it isn't. Which is an indictment of how most people have treated me, and not a reflection on you." She picked her spoon back up. "Eat before it gets cold. We can figure out the rest as we go." He ate. The first taste did to him what her food always did to people who were paying attention. It stopped them. Made them still, made them present in a way that the world didn't usually require. "It's better," he said, "than the version you made Webb the first day. Everything gets better with time and practice. That's not a philosophy, just a fact." "What changed?" I let the braise go 40 minutes longer, and I added a small amount of something acidic at the end to cut the richness. She considered her bowl. The acid was Ruth's idea, actually. She tasted it 2 days ago and said it needed something to wake it up. She was right. Cole smiled at that. A full one, not the almost smile she'd been seeing for weeks. It changed his face in a way she registered and filed away. "She's going to be extraordinary," he said. "She already is. She just needs the world to grow large enough to hold her." Della looked at her bowl. "That's what this is for, all of it. The job, the room, the conversation we're having right now. I am building a world large enough to hold my children." "I know." He said it simply without adding to it, which was exactly right. They finished the meal, and Della cleared the bowls, and Cole did not offer to help, and then did help anyway quietly, the way he did useful things, without announcement or expectation of acknowledgement. She washed and he dried, and they worked in the comfortable silence that she had come to understand was not the absence of something, but the presence of something that didn't need words. "Webb said yes," Cole said when they were done. "I spoke to him this afternoon before I came here. 2 weeks ago by letter and in person this afternoon." He folded the drying cloth with the neat precision of a man who had spent years in situations where small habits mattered. "I start Monday." "I know. He told me. Before or after you talked him into it?" "He didn't need much talking. You come with a reference from Morrison, which in this part of Montana is as good as a reference from God, and the evidence of your own work is in the fact that the most dangerous man in the territory is in custody." She dried her hands. "I may have mentioned that you were a man who understood how to handle a situation without making it bigger than it needed to be. Is that what I am? Among other things." He looked at her for a moment across the kitchen, in the low light of the banked stove and the lamp on the work table, and the thing between them that had been building since the first night at the fire in the Highlands was present and quiet and not going anywhere. "I'm going to be careful with you," he said. "With all three of you. I need you to know that. I do know it. And if there comes a time when what I am or what I've done is more than you want near your children, I need you to tell me straight, no softening. You know I'm not built for softening." "I know. I'm asking for the confirmation anyway." Della looked at him with the full weight of a woman who had learned the hard way that some promises needed to be made out loud to be real. "I will tell you straight," she said. "And I expect the same." "You have it." She nodded once. The kind of nod that closed things. The kind that meant it was settled. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, her dark hair loose, and her eyes carrying the look of a child who had been awake listening and was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. "Are you staying?" she asked Cole in the direct, no preamble way she asked everything. "For now, yes," he said. "If that's all right with you." Ruth considered him for exactly her standard 3 seconds. "Henry will be impossible tomorrow. He'll talk about nothing else." "I can handle Henry." "I know you can." She looked at her mother, and something passed between them, the particular communication of a woman and her daughter, who had been each other's entire support system for too long, and were only now learning what it felt like to not hold all of it alone. Ruth looked back at Cole. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Ruth." She disappeared down the hall, and her footsteps were light and quick, the footsteps of a child heading to sleep without the particular weight she'd been carrying for 2 months. Della heard it, the lightness of them. She turned back to Cole and found him already looking at her, and for a moment she let herself simply stand there in her kitchen in Cutter's Creek, in the hotel she had crossed a wilderness to reach, with her children asleep down the hall, and a man who had not once asked her to be smaller than she was standing across from her in the warm kitchen dark. "Go get some rest," she said finally. "You've been on the road for 3 weeks." "I have." He took his hat from the hook by the door where he'd hung it without being asked, the natural, easy gesture of a man who was already learning where things went. "Della." "Good night, Cole." He smiled, that full one, the real one. Good night." The door closed behind him, and Della stood alone in her kitchen for a moment. Her kitchen in her place in the town she had chosen, and the life she had built from nothing, except 2 months of cold and will, and the absolute refusal to let the world's judgment of her worth become the truth. She turned off the lamp. She walked down the hall to the room where her children slept, and she stood in the doorway, and listened to them breathe Ruth, even and steady. Henry, with the small occasional sound he'd made since infancy, the tiny vocal punctuation of a boy busy even in his dreams. She thought about the woman who had stood in the alley behind the Grand Continental Hotel in Billings in October with 2 children and a pack and a Dutch oven, and a road that led into the unknown. And she thought about the woman standing in this doorway now. And she understood that they were the same woman, that nothing essential had changed, that the wilderness had not made her into someone new, but had simply stripped away everything that wasn't real, until what remained was what had always been there, the part of her that knew her own worth, and refused to let anyone else set the price. She pulled the door halfway closed the way she always did, so the light from the hallway reached them without waking them, and she went to her own cot and lay down and looked at the ceiling. In the morning she would cook breakfast for 50 people. In the afternoon, she would meet with Webb about the spring menu, and with Eleanor about the sourcing for summer. In the evening, she would cook dinner for whoever came through the doors of the Sentinel Hotel, seeking something good, and she would give it to them the way she had always given it, completely and without apology, with the full force of every year she had spent learning how. And one day, not yet, but not far, she would have her own kitchen in her own place, with her name above the door, or maybe without it, and her children would grow up knowing that their mother had looked at a world that told her to stay small, and had decided clearly and finally, and without drama, that she had not crossed the Montana highlands in November to be small for anyone. Della Voss closed her eyes. Outside Cutter's Creek settled into the cold quiet of a winter night, and somewhere down the main street, Cole Hargrove was finding his way to a room in a town where he had finally, after 6 years of motion, decided to stop. And in the back room of the Sentinel Hotel, in the warmth that Della had built from nothing, her children slept without weight. She had told Ruth they were going somewhere better. She had made it true.